Okay, so picking up from the last video, this is me now past Pierce Point Ranch heading to North Pond 2. I say this many times that I'm out here, but what a difference the cloud layer makes. It just burned off and I went from 3 layers and a beanie to t-shirt, shorts, and this hat. I mean, it changes drastically. We're talking about in the span of 5 minutes. So the elk at the southern troughs definitely took to the water that was provided. Let's not forget that that is the behavior of the healthier looking elk, the ones that look a little less desperate. So if they're reacting this positively to the trough, I feel like it's a valid theory to guess the elk that look really desperate will take kindly to the trough. So I'm getting close. This shot is just to show everyone where I am. Depending on the size of screen that you're using, you might not be able to tell what you're looking at, but that's North Pond 2 on the left. There's an arrow. There's a group of elk to the right, and obviously that person is on the hiking path. Pretty hard to prove exactly when I got here without someone else following me and documenting me, but the moment I came over this hill and saw Central Pond 2, I saw elk drinking out of the trough. So I'm pretty far away and set up my camera to capture it. I don't know why I said Central Pond 2. Obviously, it's North Pond 2. The real takeaway is the timing and what I'm seeing. I arrived in the park. The second I pulled over and went and set up my camera, there were elk drinking from the trough in the south part. I hiked 9 miles, get here, set up my camera. Elk are drinking out of the trough over here too. Yeah, it looks like he's having to dip his head pretty deep into the trough, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's not gravity fed and that they aren't refilling it. Let's speed up this footage a little bit. As I take a wider angle, look at North Pond 2. Notice that there aren't any elk there trying to drink. There is one elk in the foreground foraging, but not drinking. And now you see the elk over here next to the trough. So they've abandoned what is a quote-unquote natural water source for this trough. And I say quote because that's a man-made cattle pond, which lets you know it's probably disgusting, but it's been there a long time. So human-made or not, something that's been there that long is closer to being natural than this object that's been suddenly provided, and yet the elk prefer this new object. Tells you something about the quality of the water in North Pond 2. And this is the elk that was foraging and now has come over to get a drink. I've already seen 2 elk in 2 minutes drink out of the trough here. In only 2 minutes. You also notice that they're congregating in a new area. They are not congregating next to the pond, they're congregating around the trough. They've already changed that behavior. Let me go and speed this footage up. You can see that they're very cautious. It's quite different from livestock. Wild animals always looking around, making sure that there's no threat as they get the water that they so desperately need. You still can't sacrifice your safety. Notice the difference in the elk here. This is known as an area where the males hang out. They don't have their own harem. They haven't formed their own subherd, unless you want to count these males hanging out as a subherd. But notice the difference. The male at the other trough that I pointed out had his subherd and was going to drive away any other males. These guys don't have their females. They don't have their subherd, and they're sharing the water. They're sharing the whole area. It's like a fraternity. Look at the absolute garbage that they have to graze on. I'm going to repeat this in every one of my videos until it sinks in. The Park Service finally admitted that the elk were dying of malnutrition, but we refused to say that they were dying of lack of water. And yet, what did they do? They brought in water and refused to bring in food. That doesn't make any sense. And clearly, they were lacking water also. They're having to put their heads in a lot deeper at this trough than the other trough. I can't tell at this distance, but it looks like they're drinking. I hope they aren't trying to drink and unable to because it's already empty or too low. Now that I'm back home, able to look at this on a big screen without the glare of the sun and able to zoom in, they definitely look like they're drinking, but it is indeed quite low. And these are the elk that need the water the most, so I immediately began to be concerned that they were going to run out of water first. And, like I said, there's no gravity-fed tank, so this is going to have to be refilled by some other means. Take a look at North Pond 2. This is the most abundant source of water in the entire elk reserve. Let that sink in. This garbage, this muck-filled crap, this mud pond filled with disease, is the best in the entire elk reserve. And you can see that the elk rejected it in favor of a human-provided foreign object trough of water. Prior to that better option arriving, you can see by the disturbances on the shore that the elk were actually desperate enough to try and access this. And you can see the disturbed mud where the elk would drag themselves out after, trying to get water from what is essentially a death trap. And we found the bodies of the elk left behind, risking themselves, risking their lives in a situation that you got to think that a wild animal would not subject itself to if there were better options. All of those disturbances that you see on the shore, that's the elk that crawled in on their knees up to their chests trying to access what is actually not very healthy water. And that's the desperation level that these elk were facing. Again, I know it's hard to believe. That's the most abundant source of water in the entire elk reserve. In the meantime, they're hauling in water for the cattle, putting up new troughs for the cattle every day. Cattle breaking through fences and drying up, sucking up, gulping up natural water sources that they aren't allowed to access. And all the time, the Park Service is saying, oh, the elk are fine. The elk have plenty of water. The second that these troughs were provided, the elk went for them, which by itself proves that the Park Service was downplaying the situation, downplaying the desperation of the elk, repeatedly stating that the elk had plenty of water and that lack of water wasn't the problem. And yet, when a good source of water was provided, they went for it. And by the way, they went for it when the activists brought out water, before the Park Service did. The Park Service had to be shamed into finally doing what they should have been doing. And we have footage of the elk immediately taking to the troughs that the activists brought in, way before the Park Service finally, through lawsuits and public shaming, brought out troughs.